We are starting with the next session. I welcome the two new chairpersons, Dr. DC Jain and Dr. CS Agrawal, who are very well known, and Dr. Gyanendra is also available. Yes. And for Dr. Sujata is there? No. No. Okay. So I welcome the three chairpersons, Dr. DC Jain sir, Dr. CS Agrawal sir, and Dr. Gyanendra. So I hand over the stage to you all, and now you manage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Achal, for doing a wonderful job. And you have organized this DNA virtual conference first time, and it's wonderfully organized. And I would like to invite the first speaker, Dr. Uzma Begum. Dr. Uzma Begum is here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good evening,
Are
sir.
you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So her topic is an unusual cause of perioperative cardiac arrest, a patient of trigeminal neuralgia. Dr. Uzma, please continue.
Yes, sir. Good evening, everyone. I am presenting a case report. An unusual cause of cardiac arrest in a patient who patients of trigeminal neuralgia. Sudden cardiac arrest is a dreaded complication in neurosurgical patients because it usually heralds the occurrence of an acute critical neurological event like acute hydrocephalus and tonsil herniation. Sometimes it may occur due to an acute cardiac event like acute myocardial infarction and life-threatening arrhythmias. But occasionally, some other precipitating factors may be responsible for this alarming occurrence. Here we present an unusual cause of a sudden cardiac arrest in a patient who underwent a macrovascular decompression for a trigeminal neuralgia in our institution. The case was 68 years old male patient, operated case of left trigeminal neuralgia, scheduled for redo macrovascular decompression under GA in right lateral position. The patient was hypertensive for last 2 years. Preoperative evaluation was unremarkable except the history of hypertension, which was controlled on antihypertensive medications. Investigation revealed left axis deviation in the ECG, and 2D showed left ventricular hypertrophy and moderate LV dysfunction with ejection fraction 40%. Perioperative management. Standard anesthesia technique was given with due precautions. Surgery and anesthesia per se were uneventful. However, there was a difficulty in urinary catheterization. Urinary catheterization was attempted with 16, then 12, then 10 French Foley's catheter, and every time resistance was encountered. After 3 unsuccessful attempts and slight traumatic bleeding, an infant feeding tube number 6 was finally inserted. Total intraoperative fluid was 2.5 liter with no diuretics used. Total urine output was only 250 ml in urine bag, but OT table sheet was also wet. It was presumed that though the smaller catheter size was preventing a complete drainage of urine into the urine bag, but since the OT table sheet was wet and urine was leaking around the catheter and being drained, so no further action was taken. At the end of the surgery, patient was turned supine and anesthesia was reversed. Patient was conscious, responding to oral commands with normal respiration and normal motor power and airway reflexes. Tracheal extubation was performed. At this point, we observed that there is a distension of the abdomen, and we examined the abdomen, and which was revealed a grossly over distended bladder right up to the umbilicus. Since the patient was awake and fully conscious and could void urine, so we decided to remove the infant feeding tube, which was blocked by the clots, and the patient was asked to self-void, and he voided about 300 ml of urine. Patient was subsequently shifted to the neurosurgery ICU for further observation. In the neurosurgery ICU, ECG, invasive blood pressure, and oxygen saturation monitoring was instituted, and intravenous fluid normal saline was started. Patient was stable and was maintaining normal vital parameters. However, after 30 minutes, patient had sudden progressive bradycardia, and over the next 30 seconds, heart rate decreased rapidly from 74 to 52, and then 32, and BP fell from 148 by 88 to 80 by 40 millimeter of mercury, and ECG rhythm finally progressed to complete asystole, which was associated with loss of consciousness and loss of respiration. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was started immediately, and injection atropine was given, and chest compression was started, along with adrenaline. Meanwhile, mass ventilation was done, and trachea was intubated, and patient was put on mechanical ventilation. However, patient became conscious, and spontaneous respiration was returned within 5 minutes of the CPR. During chest compression, we also again found a distended abdomen along with doubling of urine with each compressions. Immediately, bladder evacuation was done with infant feeding tube. Post CPR vitals was maintained, except the BP, which was maintained by the dobutamine infusion. Post CPR, ABG and blood and sugar levels were normal. 12-lead ECG has showed ST elevation in the anterior inferior leads, and qualitative TOPT was negative. Cardiology opinion was taken, and they advised continuous ECG, heart and BP monitoring, and TOPT and 12-lead ECG was also advised to repeat every 12 hourly for 48 hours. Over the next 2 hours, we tapered off the dobutamine and weaned him off from the ventilator support, and tracheal extubation was successfully performed. Subsequently, an echocardiography and CT scan of brain were done and did not reveal any new or significant findings respectively. TOPT and CPK values and ECG changes over 48 hours were corresponding with those which, seen in post CPR patients, and not indicative any myocardial infarction. After further inquiring, patient revealed a history of difficulty in voiding urine for last 6 months, for which the USG lower abdomen was done, which revealed which the features were suggestive of benign prostatic hypertrophy. Further hospital course was uneventful, and the patient was discharged on 7th day of the post-op. Now let's discuss the highlights of the case. 68 years old patient with history of hypertension and moderate LV dysfunction underwent a macrovascular decompression. He had a difficulty in urinary catheterization and have a grossly distended urinary bladder intra and post-op. Half an hour after transfer, patient had a sudden episode of bradycardia and hypotension, which was progressed to cardiac arrest within the 30 seconds. Now, what are the possible causes which lead to this cardiac event? Acute neurological event and acute myocardial infarction were less likely, as the patient revived immediately without any neurological sequelae, and CT was normal, and echo showed no new changes, and the cardiac enzymes and the ECG changes were commensurate with the post CPR values, or not with any acute MI. Also, trigeminal cardiac reflex was the least likely cause, as it usually an intraoperative event. So the possible cause was more likely was the acute severe vasovagal reaction due to grossly overdistended bladder. Acute bladder distension is known to trigger a vasovagal reflex, which is mediated by the vagus nerve and is characterized by a sudden drop in the heart rate, blood pressure, and cardiac output. Drainage of urinary bladder as its definitive treatment terminates this reflex. Now let's discuss the mechanism of the vasovagal reflex. Whenever there is a rapid increase in the intravesical pressure due to acute urinary retention, the mechanoreceptors which are situated at the vesical trigone are stimulated. This stimulation is transferred through the hypogastric and sacral plexus to the vagus nerve, and which lead to increase in the parasympathetic tone, which was associated with poor sympathetic tone, and results in slowing of the heart rate and a vasodilation of the systemic circulation, and which ultimately result in certain severe hemodynamic manifestations like hypotension, bradycardia, including asystole. Bladder overdistension is generally ignored and often considered an innocuous cause, which can lead to vasovagal reflex, significant enough to cause a near arrest situation, as reported by the following literatures. Our patient had some series of unfortunate events like history of difficulty in voiding urine, difficulty in urinary catheterization intraoperatively, and patient's bladder became overdistended intraoperative and post-operative. Despite self-voiding at the end of the surgery, the bladder was not emptied completely due to pre-existing BPH, patient position, and opioid-induced inhibition of voiding reflex. Also, administration of fluids in the ICU caused a repeat overdistension of the bladder, which triggered the vasovagal reflex, leading to sudden bradycardia, hypertension, and asystole. Now we can say all's well that ends well. The hemodynamic instability and cardiac arrest were noted instantly. Prompt cardiopulmonary resuscitation measures were instituted. The chest compressions probably also increase the intra-abdominal pressure, which lead to spontaneous voiding of copious amount of urine and subsequently spontaneous termination of the vasovagal reflex. The patient recovered rapidly and without any systemic sequelae. Now I would like to conclude by saying acute bladder overdistension is an important but rather overlooked cause of severe hemodynamic disturbances. A high degree of suspicion should be maintained for its occurrence, and a history of difficulty in voiding urine should be evaluated preoperatively, especially in the older patients. Thank you.
Dr. Uzma, well presented.
Thank you,
I'll
sir.
just, one thing which you have mentioned here is that you missed that this patient has, difficulty in voiding urine, which should have been actually picked up in this, which you
Yes,
have
sir. Yes, sir.
definitely mentioned. What are the other presentation which can happen because of distended bladder intraoperatively, or besides what you see as you presented this as bradycardia, leading up to cardiac arrest? So any other presentation which can happen?
Per se, rupture never occurred as a bladder is a very distensible organ.
Yeah.
And
Any other presentation which should direct you intraoperatively that there can be something lead to distension of bladder? You have mentioned in one of the slides that hemodynamic instability, right? Especially
Yes,
kind of usually not only present with bradycardia, it may even present with tachycardia.
yes, sir.
Yeah. So if it, after doing everything, nothing is happening and there is no much urine, so you can think of hyperdistension of bladder.
Sympathetic oversurge.
Thank
you. Okay.
Since there are no more questions, I'll just like to call upon Dr. Jyotsna Singh to present her case.
Yes, sir. Is my screen is visible?
Yeah,
yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Please make full screen.
Sure, sir. Can I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening to all. I'm Jyotsna Singh, PhD scholar of Department of Pathology. The title of my presentation is Gene Expression-Based Profiling of Pleomorphic Xanthroastrocytoma, highlights two prognostic subgroups. Pleomorphic xanthroastrocytoma, or PXA, is a rare astrocytic neoplasm designated as grade 2 by WHO, and it seems dominantly in children and young adults, and the seizure is the commonmost presentation. Most of the cases are temporal in location, and on radiology, they are seen as circumscribed superficial solid cystic masses, whereas on histology, in majority of the tumors, giant desire cells are seen and they can mimic glioblastoma. The overall prognosis is good with 10-year survival of 70% cases. Although most of the cases are cured with surgery, however, in a substantial portion of cases, progression, recurrence, and diffuse deaccumulation via CSF has been noted. Therefore, in 2016, a term anaplastic PXA was introduced for tumor showing 5 or more mitosis per 10 high power field with or without necrosis. These tumors usually have a poor prognosis with overall 5-year survival of 57% as compared to PXA. Further, there are some reports which says that rare transformation to epithelioid glioblastoma has been reported in these tumors. Lacunae. Diagnosis solely based on histopathology is subjective and provide little insight into the underlying biology of PXA or their treatment strategies. Although surgery and radiotherapy being performed in majority of PXA, but there is no formal guidelines for the management of these cases. Therefore, further, there is no comprehensive studies on molecular biology of tumors. That's why this study was undertaken with the aim of performing gene expression-based profiling of these tumors and their comparison with tumor histology and clinical profile of the patients. And also we aimed to identify a robust gene panel which could be used as a diagnostic, prognostic, and therapeutic biomarker for the routine clinical practices. It's a multi-institutional study, and in a multi-institutional efforts, there are 30 cases were identified over a period of 12 to 13 years, and all those cases were reevaluated according to WHO 2016 classification. And cases with adequate tissue were taken up for the analysis. After this, an extensive panel of IHC marker and BRAF mutation was assessed in all these cases. After that, genome-wide expression profiling was performed, and extensive bioinformatic analysis was also performed. And the most significant genes were validated by QRT-PCR. And finally, the results were correlated with histopathological and clinical finding of the patient. In this study, a total of 20 PUXA and 4 control samples were analyzed by microarray. The age range of the patient was 10 to 52 years, and the majority of the cases were young adults. And in this study, 65% of the cases were grade 2, and there was a male majority. On principal component analysis and unbiased hierarchical clustering, PUXA were clearly distinct from control samples. And further, there were 2 clusters, which is PUXA cluster 1 and PUXA cluster 2 were identified. And in PUXA cluster 1, majority of the cases were of grade 2, whereas in PUXA 2, the majority of the cases are of grade 3. On immunohistochemical profiling, majority of the cases in PUXA cluster 1 were young adults, while all the cases in cluster 2 were seen above the age of 35. However, there is no difference in histology, immunohistochemical profiling, or frequency of BRAF mutation in these 2 clusters has been observed. Finally, the deregulation of several genes, including tumor suppressor gene, oncogene, and cancer driver genes, was seen in both the clusters, which basically mediate different pathways. Finally, 8 genes with most significant values were selected from these, which were significantly dysregulated among these 2 clusters, and out of which MTFP1 and CDK14 were validated by QRT-PCR. MTFP1 is a nuclear encoded protein, promotes mitochondrial fusions. MTFP1 was upregulated in PUXA cluster 1. Increased expression of MTFP1 and its association with tumor progression has been documented in several cancers. However, its exact role in carcinogenesis has not been explored yet. CDK14 is a known cell cycle regulator, and it is upregulated in PUXA cluster 2 as compared to PUXA cluster 1. And CDK1 is shown to be associated with poor prognosis in glioma and is also being explored as potential therapeutic target. Follow-up. Our follow-up periods of patients varied from 1.5 years to 14.5 years with a mean follow-up of 4.6 years, and nearly 83% cases in cluster 2 record, while only 8% records was observed in cluster 1. Survival analysis. Based on the histopathological grading, there was no significant difference in overall survival, but statistically, significant difference in progression-free survival was observed between grade 2 and grade 3. And the similar pattern was observed in expression array, but difference in progression-free survival between these 2 groups was definitely more significant as compared to histology. On overview, there was improper prognostication of 3 cases by histology, and there is only 1 case which was improperly diagnosed as by microRNA profiling. Thus, progression prediction efficacy of mRNA profiling is better than histology. Thus, to conclude, mRNA profiling provides definitive insight into PUXA's biology, as we could identify unrecognized heterogeneity within the same grade. It is better platform for risk stratification, as we could observe distinct survival in these 2 molecular subgroups, and prediction of recurrence was seen in 95% cases versus 85% cases by histology, but we need more cases to validate our finding. This platform is very accurate as we see a strong correlation with QRT PCR analysis as well. And this, finally, the gene signature CDK14, which is identified in the present study in cluster 2, can be used as a prognostic and therapeutic biomarker. For future plans, we wish to check immunohistochemistry as a surrogate marker for CDK14 expression and develop a robust and cost-effective small panel of biomarker which could be used for routine clinical workup of PAXA. Further, CDK14 can be explored across different institutes and in various platforms for its efficacy as a prognostic and therapeutic biomarker. Thank you.
Can I start with? So, Dr. Joshna,
Yes, ma'am.
my first question is, what was the cost of this sequencing?
Ma'am, our 20 samples were analyzed by the use of, with the help of like 4 lakhs. The total cost of the experiment was 4 lakh.
Oh, and what was the correlation between anaplastic PXA and PAX2? How many of anaplastic were PAX2 cases?
Ma'am, wait.
PXA2 cases.
Ma'am,
Had two, PAXA2 and PAXA1 you are saying. No, so how many of anaplastic PAXA were PAXA2?
PAXA cluster 2. There was, out of 6 patients, there were 4 patients which was in PAXA cluster 2. Anaplastic PAXA in PAXA cluster 2, as I discussed in this slide. Yes, ma'am. That in PAXA cluster 2, 67% were APAXA, which is anaplastic WHO grade 2, and in PAXA cluster 1, 79% cases of PAXA grade 2. Though there's the major problem which come here is this 22% and 33% cases. Why these 22% APAXA are in PAXA cluster 1, and why these 33% grade 2 tumors are in PAXA cluster 2? So basically, this is the even though histopathologically clearly diagnose 80% cases correctly, but still there is 20 to 30% cases which might be misdiagnosed, or which might be some there's some problem with these patients.
Maybe so because the tumor is very heterogeneous. And
yes, exactly.
All these, especially all type of gliomas, are very heterogeneous. So if the sample taken for histopathology or for molecular were not exactly representative, so you may have a variation in your molecular diagnosis and your histodiagnosis.
Yes, ma'am. That's...
Let's see how much CDK14 will help us
prognostication and as a therapeutic target. But still, there are lots of study which talks about that, yes, CDK14 can be used in gliomas as a therapeutic target. It's a very well-known marker.
Yeah, it is. But you see, PXA are not so common. You have found only 30 cases in 12 years. Yes. So, so to evaluate this is going to be tough.
Yes, ma'am. This is, but still there is a entity which is the WHO tell us that is a PAXA is an entity, though we should take care of this thing. Still, there's 20 to 30% cases which are misdiagnosed. We should be responsible for them as well.
Yeah, we have to take care because this occurs in young age group also.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joshna.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
We invite the third speaker, Dr. Akhil Saheb. He is going to present paraneoplastic peripheral neuropathy in papillary carcinoma of thyroid, which is a rare presentation. Dr. Akhil Saheb.
Thank you so much, sir.
Dr. Akhil.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for inviting me for this presentation in this esteemed panel. I am now going to share my screen. I am Dr. Akhil. I am going to present a case of paraneoplastic peripheral neuropathy in papillary carcinoma of thyroid, which is a rare presentation. Our patient is a 63-year-old gentleman. He's historically hypertensive, coronary artery disease post PTCA in 2010. He recently recovered from COVID, mild COVID with home quarantine only in April 2020. Now he presented to us in ending November 2020 with chief complaints of episodes of palpitation, diaphoresis associated with abdominal bloating since 2.5 months, with history of burning in bilateral feet and hands since 2 months, numbness in bilateral feet since 20 days, and weakness in gripping with slippers since last 15 days. Now, since last 2.5 months, he had recurrent bouts of chest tightness, palpitation, diaphoresis, and abdominal bloating, which was initially thought to be cardiac. And he underwent check angio for that, which was absolutely normal. There was associated erectile dysfunction, which was present for the same duration also. And one important history was that he had significant loss of weight over 3 months. He was weighing around 80 kgs, and when he came to us, he was 65 kgs. So it was significant. And 2 months back, he presented with history of burning sensation observed in bilateral feet, initially on the plantar aspect, and it slowly, it was insidious in onset, and it progressed over 10 days to involve up to bilateral hips. It was only burning sensation initially with no numbness, no other sensory deficit. After 1 week of this presentation, he had similar burning features in bilateral hands on both anterior and posterior aspect, which involved up to elbow in a 10 days period. It was also associated with pain in bilateral hands and feet, especially in the night. And before presenting to us, before last 20 days, he complained of numbness in bilateral feet on the plantar aspect. And since last 15 days, he had slight difficulty in gripping with slippers, but not associated with any slippage of slippers. There was no history of associated stiffness, myalgias, cramps, fasciculations, radicular pain, band-like sensation, or any bowel-bladder involvement. No history of gait imbalance, wash basin phenomena, tremors, dysarthria, or any other cranial nerve involvement. There was no history of abnormal movements, loss of consciousness, seizure. There was no skin rash, no hypopigmented patch, no lesion, no joint pain, no photosensitivity, no oral or genital ulcers, no dryness in mouth or eyes, or Raynaud's phenomena. There was no palpable swelling, no hemoptysis, hemoptysis, hematuria, altered bowel habits, or gluten sensitivity in history. There was no history of diabetes or thyroid disease, and there was no history of any use of herbal medicines. Past history, he had anterior wall MI in 2010, for which PTCA was done. He recovered from mild COVID into April 2020 at home, in home quarantine only. And he was a vegetarian, non-smoker, didn't consume alcohol, and family history were non-significant. So our patient is a 63-year-old gentleman with hypertension, CAD post-PTCA with mild COVID in April 2020, recovered, presented with significant weight loss in 3 months, followed by features of small fiber neuropathy in the form of progressive burning and pain in lower limbs, followed by upper limbs, with features suggestive of autonomic involvement since last 2.5 months, followed by large fiber involvement in the form of weakness, in the form of difficulty in gripping slippers since last 20 days of presentation. So with this history, we had made following differentials. Our first differential was to rule out metabolic or nutritional cause, diabetes, B12 deficiency, and hypothyroidism, inflammatory amyloidosis, and vasculitis. Considering his age and significant weight loss, we had to rule out, and small fiber neuropathy, we had to rule out paraneoplastic, infective like hepatitis B, C, HIV, and leprosy. Autoimmune, sarcoid, SLE, Sjogren's, and scleroderma can present as small fiber neuropathy. In toxins, we had to rule out B6 intoxication and thallium. And in hereditary cause, we had to rule out familial amyloid polyneuropathy. And the rare case, cervical spondylosis can present in the similar way in the form of small fiber neuropathy also. So that is also important condition we have to rule out. So in general physical examination, there was nothing, no skin, hair, or nail abnormality. There was no palpable lymphadenopathy. There was no nerve thickening also. In neurological examination, only in sensory examination, there was a graded sensory loss in fine touch, pain, and temperature till knees in lower limb and till elbows in upper limb. Vibration was impaired up to ankle, and joint position was intact. Romberg's was negative. In investigation, we could see that his albumin globulin ratio was normal. His B12 was normal. His viral markers were normal. His HbA1c was normal. 2D echo was not suggestive of any restrictive cardiomyopathy. His ANA, NCA, ENA, ACE, everything was normal. His M-band was negative. Toxic screen suggested raised level of zinc and molybdenum. As we took out the history, he was taking the multivitamins that was containing zinc and molybdenum, and we had done tests within 1 week of this. No evidence of any arsenic, mercury, or thallium. His paraneoplastic and antiganglioside panel was negative. Autoimmune function was suggestive of severe orthostatic hypotension was present. His CSF was, his serum VDRL was negative. His CSF was normal, including because of his past history of COVID. We had done a COVID RT-PCR that was also negative. So in view of hypertension, his cortisol was negative. His serum free light chain assay was negative. Tumor markers were negative. His thyroid profile was negative. CRP was normal. His NCS was suggestive of mixed axonal and demyelinating sensory motor neuropathy in upper and lower limb. His thyroglobulin level that we had done after that came high to 52 nanogram per ml. His PET CT was, whole body was done. That was absolutely normal. And his ultrasound abdomen and neck was done. That was suggestive of 1.1 into 1.2 centimeter nodule in the right thyroid. So it is important to note that the PET CT missed the nodule and ultrasound picked up the nodule in this case. His abdominal fat PET biopsy was negative for amyloidosis, and MRI brain and spine was non-specific. So we went for FNAC thyroid in this case, and which revealed both GIMSA and pap smears. We can see that there is follicular cells are arranged in the papilla. In this, we can see there is overcrowding of nuclei and there are nuclear grooves present. So they had given impression of Bethesda stage 5 to rule out malignancy papillary thyroid carcinoma in this patient. So with this complaint, with progression, with the chronic with progression was more than 8 weeks, so we decided to manage this patient initially with IVIG, which he received 130 grams over 5 days. And after 10 days, he had 70% improvement in his symptoms. We offered him thyroidectomy, but he's a doctor himself, so he wanted to take second and third opinion. And after taking this second and third opinion, his wife called me 2 days back, and they have told that they are getting admitted for thyroidectomy. So coming to paraneoplastic neuropathy, it is a neuropathy that is not due to direct infiltration or metastatic deposit or a consequence of cancer treatment. It is these syndromes are present in 1% of all cancers, and they can precede the cancer by years also. So criteria for definite paraneoplastic neuropathy is either there is a presence of onconeural antibody, that is there is a direct pathological link between tumor and neuropathy, or if there is a well-established neurological syndrome in the form of neuropathy, and an onconeural antibody can be absent. And third, if the neuropathy improves of the treatment of tumor. So this is the criteria. And if the neuropathy is present within 2 years of cancer, it can be considered as a case of possible paraneoplastic disorder, provided you have ruled out all other disorders. So classification of paraneoplastic neuropathy, we can see basically there are neuronopathies, sensory motor neuropathies without gammopathy, with gammopathy, and those patients who have neuromyotonia. So all these features should be considered while evaluating the patient of neuropathy in elderly. So our patient had a sensory motor neuropathy without gammopathy, and it was axonal and demyelinating. Predominantly, it was axonal, and it can be present in carcinoma and Hodgkin's lymphoma. Usually the antibodies markers are usually negative. And it is a very rare and very few case reports have been present in this type of neuropathy. So suspecting paraneoplastic neuropathy, as I have already mentioned, that if the patient has neuromyotonia, presence of onconeural antibody, gammopathy, autoimmune involvement, a CSF which is inflammatory, provided you have ruled out all other causes of inflammatory CSF, and the neuropathy has an unusual evolution, that like if you are suspecting B12 deficiency, you are treating that, but the patient continues to worsen if in spite of treatment, then you should think about this neuropathy also. Now coming to papillary carcinoma of thyroid, is the most common type of thyroid malignancy, and it is the excellent cancer to have, because otherwise no cancer is excellent, but the 5-year survival rate in this cancer is regional papillary carcinoma of thyroid is 99 and 78% in metastatic carcinomas. So it is a very indolent cancer, and patient can usually not diagnosed, not detected of this cancer. Otherwise, we have to find it with ultrasound. Otherwise, these cancers can go and carry on for years, and someday there can be a lymph node or some swelling in the thyroid lobe. Then we can find these cancers. So there are few case reports of association of peripheral neuropathy in carcinoma of thyroid. First one was published in 1961 when onconeural antibodies were not present. A recent case report by Angela Vincent group has shown a patient of paraneoplastic sensory ganglionopathy with papillary carcinoma of thyroid. In this patient, they had found a CRIMP5 and a VGKC antibody also, but they have mentioned that these antibodies were not pathognomonic in this patient, and patient improved significantly after giving IVIG and was treated with thyroidectomy also. And so they concluded that this patient was a case of paraneoplastic sensory ganglionopathy. Now coming to very important point, that PET versus USG. As we can see in our patient, we missed the finding in PET. Only PET was absolutely normal. So in this study, we have seen that sensitivity of FDG PET in papillary carcinoma of thyroid is 71% only. And sensitivity for USG without FNA, even in micropapillary carcinoma, is 86%. So we have to look for this papillary carcinoma by doing a screening with ultrasound. Like the limitation of our study was.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. You have to wind up because you have exceeded your time, please. You have just finished off in.
My take-home message is that we recommend role of USG NEC as a workup in neuropathy, especially if there is suspicion of idiopathic, because 1/3 are idiopathic, or paraneoplastic neuropathy, like we are doing USG tests. In addition to PET, we have to look for USG NEC also, and one should search for this cause, as treatment is very rewarding. Now, I thank all my teachers and especially Dr. Achal for giving me opportunity to speak in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akhil.
Thank you, sir.
What happened? You treated by thyroidectomy?
Patient is now admitted and thyroidectomy is planned for, sir, 1-2 days.
And what the literature says, after thyroidectomy, he will improve?
Sir, usually there is not complete recovery after thyroidectomy. The literature says that there is only partial recovery in case of paraneoplastic neuropathy. Even in the case of the case report I showed, there was not 100% complete recovery, only partial recovery, and patient received IVIG also.
Your PET scan showed that there was evidence of peripheral neuropathy.
No, sir.
No.
PET
Okay.
scan was normal.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We invite the Dr. C.S. Agarwal. CS has joined. Now I invite Dr. Varun Rihani. Dr. Varun, you are ready?
Yes, sir.
Series
I'll
of
start.
IgG4 related neurological disease at a tertiary care center in North India.
Thank you. Good evening to all the judges and all the panelists. The topic of my presentation is on series of IgG4 related neurological disease at a tertiary care center in North India. The study has been conducted in our hospital, in Army Hospital, Research and Referral Hospital. As we know that IgG4 related disease is a multi-system immune-mediated fibroinflammatory disease having a diverse presentation with neurological involvement described very uncommonly for this. In fact, the prevalence itself has been very poorly defined. The aim of this study was to describe and characterize neurological features in patients with IgG4-related disease as per the international guidance statement given in 2015 and assess their outcomes at 3 months. This was an ambidextrous observation study conducted at Department of Neurology, Army Hospital, in March 2018 to March 2020. The inclusion criteria for diagnosing IgG4-related disease was on the basis of clinical or radiological evidence showing swelling or mass in one or more organs, or serology showing evidence of elevated IgG4 with levels more than 135 milligram per deciliter, or a definitive histopathological examination which showed marked lymphocyte and plasmacyte infiltration, storiform fibrosis, or a dense G4 plasma cell infiltration was seen, which was defined as a ratio of IgG4 to IgG plasma cells of more than equal to 40%, or total IgG4 levels of more than 10 IgG4 plasma cells per high power field. On the basis of this, the IgG4 related disease was classified as definitive when the histology was definitive with either clinical or serological criteria present. For possible, if the histological examination was either not performed or was inconclusive, then it required both clinical, radiological, and serological criteria. On the basis of this, we were able to diagnose 1 definite case and 3 possible cases. A detailed clinical evaluation for each of the case was done with history examination and a syndromic diagnosis was made. And a detailed investigative evaluation was done, which include blood-based test, imaging of the neuraxis, CSF analysis, serum IgG4 levels, and a definitive workup to rule out secondary causes like the HIV, tuberculosis, chronic infections, hepatitis, vasculitis, sarcoidosis, and paraneoplastic etiologies. And in the last, biopsy was offered to the patient. So the first case, so we as said, we had 4 cases. All of the cases were predominantly in the elderly population, more than 50. However, one was in the mid 40 years who was a serving soldier. 3 males and 1 female were found in these case series. All of them had a gradual onset and a subacute course with duration of illnesses occurring in months. The presentation of first case was of a non-compressive myeloneuropathy, in which this patient presented aphasia, stiffness, and urinary cramps, which later progressed with hand grip weakness and sensory symptoms up to the ankles. Later on examination, this was found to have human features and element features in the form of absent ankle jerks and distal hypotonia in the lower limbs with spasticity in the other parts. The second case presented with epilepsia partialis continua, in which the patient presented with headache and right upper and lower limb seizures, which later on presented with a continuous flurry of seizures as epilepsia partialis. And on improvement of the hemiparesis and of the partial seizures, facial involvement was also noticed. The third case presented with generalized seizures, and the fourth patient presented with polyneuritis cranialis, in which the patient has facial and glossopharyngeal and vagal involvement. Systemic involvement was seen in the form of chronic tubulointerstitial nephritis, mediastinal lymphadenopathy, carotid involvement, and megaly in our case. The non-compressive myeloneuropathy case had non-specific changes. There was nothing to suggest any lesion in the neuraxis. However, for the other 3 cases, pachymeningitis was found, of which focal hypertrophic pachymeningitis was found in the case of the epilepsia partialis continua, whereas diffuse supratentorial pachymeningitis was found in the other cases. CSF was abnormal in 2 cases with non-compressive myeloneuropathy and epilepsia partialis presentation. Both of them had phagocytosis of lymphocytes, proteins were slightly raised, and sugars were having normal ratio as in all the cases. Serum IgG4 were raised in all the 4 cases. In miscellaneous investigation, the myeloneuropathy case had on NCS, on the nerve conduction study, axonal sensory motor neuropathy. PET analysis showed reduced uptake of the focal hypertrophic pachymeningitis in the epilepsia partialis group. EEG showed 3 Hz spike and wave discharges in the generalized seizures. And in the polyneuritis case, all the systemic findings were found only on PET scan. Coming to the biopsy, 2 patients did not consent. The first patient, who was a definitive, showed on renal biopsy as chronic tubulointerstitial nephritis with IgG4-related disease. As this patient also had, other than the non-compressive myeloneuropathy, also had features of renal dysfunction with proteinuria and deranged KFT. That's why renal biopsy was done in this case, which showed chronic tubulointerstitial nephritis. Meningeal biopsy was in the epilepsia partialis continua. However, granulated meningitis was done. However, IgG4 staining was not performed in this case. Management-wise, prednisolone was used in all the cases. However, the generalized seizure patient was managed only with antiepileptics and was not given immunotherapy. A non-compressive myeloneuropathy patient was managed with prednisolone, azathioprine, and the MRS at presentation and remained same at 4. The epilepsia partialis continua had already been ready when the patient had come to us and was managed with addition of antiepileptics in the form of clobazam and oxcarbazepine. And later, after completion of the ATT, the patient was started on steroid and azathioprine. And however, this patient relapsed later, 6 months later. This is out of the context of the study. This patient has relapsed, and this in the form of behavioral changes, and the patient has been put on rituximab thereafter. So these are the images of the contrast enhanced images of the patient of the epilepsia partialis continua, which is showing hypertrophic enhancement involving also the gyral area, and on these PET has shown reduced uptake over the left frontoparietal region of the dura. These are the diffuse supratentorial pachymeningitis in the case of generalized seizure and of the polyneuritis cranialis. These are the histopath images, H&E images of the renal biopsy patient showing the tubulation. Densely plasma cells can be seen. The plasma cells are identified on the basis of clear basophilic staining, which appears blue. This had further proved on CD138 positivity, plasma cells were highlighted, and on IgG4 staining, the plasma cells were further seen, more than 10 per high power field. So IgG4-related disease, as we know, it is a multi-system disease, but has been accepted very lately in 2003 as a discrete immune-mediated disease, which was reported by Kamisawa et al. As Japanese have the highest incidence for this disease. the elderly group more than 50 years and involves the male population more than the female population. And in the systemic disease, it either presents as a mass lesion when it mimics as a malignancy or with symptoms of allergy or atopy. That is why serum IgE levels and eosinophils can also be raised in this case. These images are depicting the lacrimal gland enlargement and the submandibular gland enlargement. And if it also has the parotid involvement, it is known as the triad of the Mikulicz disease. These are the various forms where the IgG4 related disease has been found. Other than the neurological and the Mikulicz that I said, it can involve, as we know, it can involve the autoimmune pancreatitis, pulmonary in the form of nodules or pleural involvement mimicking tuberculosis. It can involve the kidneys. It can cause the retroperitoneal fibrosis. Pathophysiologically, it is a non-inflammatory disease because it does not do the Fc receptor. It is believed to be antigen driven. However, the antigen has never been found up to date. What happens is there are two sites where the inflammation is happening. First, the B cell, it activates with the CD4 T helper cells, CD4 cytotoxic lymphocytes and produces fibrogenic factors. And on that is at the site of the infection, whereas at the within the lymph node or the germinal centers, the T cells, it causes the B cell to release the IgG4 lymphocytes. However, these IgG4 do not normalize after treatments. This suggests that other factors are also essential for producing the IgG4. In neurologically, the four presentations that are commonly seen are the pachymeningitis, which presents with headache, and depending upon where the pachymeningitis is, it can involve the cord also, causing myeloneuropathy. It can involve, the other is the hypophysitis, in which it causes panhypopituitarism. It can cause peripheral nerve involvement, and it can cause the orbital disease, in which it is usually bilateral, painless, and involvement of the infraorbital nerve is characteristic. So these are the images showing T1 post-contrast dural based enhancement, which is on T2 showing cellular structures which are having low intensity on T2, and on methionine PET they show lower uptake. So these can be used to differentiate from other infective conditions. Serology can be normal in around 30% of the cases, and its range is very broad depending upon the organs. It is not used for monitoring or detecting relapse. Steroids can lower the IgG4 levels. Therefore, the IgG4 level should be done after these steroids have been given. IgG4 should be done before, and CSF OCBs have been reported. Methionine PET may be useful. Treatment wise, watchful wait for the asymptomatic, like we did for our patient with the seizures. We have to treat the symptomatic with the first line being steroids. Second line, we can use any of the oral immunosuppressants. Rituximab, as with the other IgG4 related disease, the Musk antibody has exquisite response and is also believed to be having a good response with this case. Monitoring with imaging, patients having abnormality can be done with follow-up imaging. So my take-home message is this disease is a diverse semiology affecting the elderly, which can mimic as a tumor or a TB or any other chronic infections. The serology is helpful in diagnosis, but is not essential. Biopsy is essential, and non-consideration of the disease may rob the patient of a treatability also. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Varun. And
Yes,
if there is any question, one question can be asked.
Sir.
If there are no questions, then we pass on to the next speaker. Dr. Manpreet Kaur Narang. Dr. Manpreet, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Manpreet is going to speak on dentatorubro-thalamic tract function in the emergence of tremors in spinocerebellar ataxia type 12. Dr. Manpreet.
Sir, my screen is visible?
Yes, visible.
Okay, sir. Good evening, everyone. Today I'm going to present a study, dentatorubro-thalamic tract dysfunction. Just a second, sir. Just a second. Today I'm going to present a study, dentatorubro-thalamic tract dysfunction in the emergence of tremor in spinocerebellar ataxia type 12. Spinocerebellar ataxia type 12 is an autosomal dominant type of hereditary ataxia. It is caused by the abnormal CAG repeat expansion in the gene PPR2R2B. The usual age of onset is the 4th decade of the life. It is the second most common dominant ataxia in the northern India. Here we can see in the graph the SCA12 is equivalent prevalent to the SCA2, which is the most common ataxia in the India. Clinically, the SCA12 typically onsets with an action tremor of the upper extremity. As the disease progresses, the cortical and the cerebral signs starts appearing like gait ataxia, dysarthria, hyperreflexia, dysmetria. Moreover, apart from the action tremor, the rest tremor of hands, head tremor, voice tremor, oropharyngeal tremor has also been reported in SCA12 patient. The hand tremor has been found to be the most common symptom in SCA12 patients. Only a single case study has reported the frequency of the action tremor, that is 3 to 4 hertz in SCA12 patients. Here we can see there is a very limited literature available on the description of the tremor of SCA12. To date, there is no study which has tried to look into the underlying mechanism of the tremor in SCA12, like it is reported in the other most common disorders, ET and PD. Here we can see in ET, PD, and multiple sclerosis, the impairment of dendrorubothalamic tract is implicated in the emergence of tremor. Something more about DRTT. The DRTT basically connects the cerebellar efferents with the white matter tract ascending from the to the motor cortex, and its main function is to regulate the fine movements. These white matter tracts can be measured by using a DTI techniques. Basically, the diffusion tensor imaging detects the isotropic diffusion of the water molecules that basically give us the orientation of the cerebellar white matter tracts. To evaluate these white matter tracts, they give us the two values. That is, one is the fractional anisotropy and the ADC values. ADC is the diffusion speed of the water molecule without indicating the direction of the movement, whereas the FAs reflect the extent of directionality of the diffusion. Its value ranges from 1 to 0. 1 means intact axon and 0 means a demyelination. When there is a nerve degeneration occur or nerve cell loss, there is the movement of the water increases. Therefore, the rate of the diffusion water molecules increases and the FA value decreases. Therefore, the objective of my study is to determine the white matter changes in the region of DRTT using a diffusion tensor imaging in SCA12 patients. For that, we have recruited 26 genetically confirmed SCA12 patients and 13 healthy controls from the Department of Neurology, AIIMS. Okay. First, we clinically assess the patient with the help of the functional FTM clinical tremor rating scale. To further explain the tremor frequency, amplitude, and pattern of muscle activation, we have used the surface EMG and accelerometer. The DTI was acquired using a 3 Tesla scanner with the B value of 0 to 800 second per mm square in the 32 directions. The FA value was calculated for the regions of the DRTT, that is dentate nucleus, red nucleus, thalamus, and the ventral lateral nucleus of the thalamus. The results of my study says the first table is showing the mean age of SCA12 patients in the healthy individuals which are recruited in the study. That is a 53.1 and 54.2 for the healthy individuals. The table 2 is showing the mean age at onset, mean age of mean duration of symptoms. The mean age at onset for the symptom of the symptoms for these patients is 47.6 plus minus 10.8, and the duration of the symptom is 4.7 plus minus 3.1. The third table is showing the mean age of onset of tremor and the mean duration of tremor for these patients. That is 43.9 plus minus 12.1 and 4.8 plus minus 2.7. Now, this is on clinically examining the patients. We have seen that out of 26 and 19 patients reported that the hand tremor was their initial symptom. The hand tremor was seen in both the ways, the bilateral manner and the unilateral manner. The 53% patient shows reported a bilateral hand tremor, and 47% patient shows the unilateral hand tremor. Following this hand tremor, there was a gait ataxia, was also seen as an initial symptom, voice tremor, and the head tremor with a unilateral hand tremor. The table 4 is showing the mean scores for the ICARS and the functional for the clinical tremor rating scale. That is 45.0 plus minus 18.2, and for the ICARS it is 40.45 plus minus 9.33. This slide is showing the electrophysiological evaluation of tremor. Here we can see if the median range for frequency for tremor is 4.45 to 4.48 for the rest, postural, and the intentional tremor, and the amplitude is a varying. It's a very large and varying. In this, all the 26 patients shows a synchronous pattern of muscle activation, which matches to the ET patients. This pattern. Here the table 5 is showing the difference between the FA value of DRTT region between the SA12 and the control. Here we can see in SA12 group the FA value is significantly reduced for the dentate left red nucleus, thalamus right and left, and the left and right for the ventrolateral nucleus. So here we can see there is a white matter loss in the SA12 patient when compared to the healthy control. Now the table 6, when we try to correlate the clinical tremor rating scores with the FA value of DRTT, we have seen that the CTRS score is significantly negatively correlated with the red nucleus. That means if the severity of the tremor increases, the atrophy in the red nucleus is also increases as the FA value is decreasing. The result of our study demonstrated that the hand tremor is the most common initial symptom in SA12. It includes all three type of tremors, that is postural, intention, and rest tremor. The tremor frequencies recorded is 4 to 5 hertz with a varying amplitudes. When it comes to the neurological part of the study, our sample showed that there is a significant reduction in the FA value of left red nucleus, thalamus, and the ventrolateral nucleus. Here we can say there is a loss of white matter in a DRTT. A recent study reported in 2020 coded that the DRT is potentially a common tremor reducing structure. In this study, they have recruited the different. They have recruited the essential tremor patient, Parkinson's patients, and the multiple sclerosis patient, and they stimulated the DRTT different region by using DBS, and they have seen results in the reduction of the tremor. So therefore, we can say that DRTT is can be a putative target for the DBS in SA12 patients for improving the tremor. Now, the conclusion, the microstructural white matter changes were found in the specific regions of the dentate nucleus, red nucleus, thalamus, and VL nucleus of DRTT in SA12 patient. The dysfunction of DRTT may be implicated in the emergence of tremor in SA12 patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manpreet.
Thank you, sir.
We will pass on to the last speaker, Dr. Murli Krishna. Murli, are you ready? He is going to speak on comparative study of sleep disturbances in episodic and chronic migraine patients using Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index and polysomnography. Dr. Murli, please go ahead.
Respected teachers and teachers, good evening, everyone. Today, my topic of the presentation is a comparative study of sleep disturbances in episodic and chronic migraine patients using Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index and polysomnography. Introduction. Although the disturbances in sleep are common among the migraineurs as compared to the general population, there are head-to-head comparison of the sleep abnormalities between the patients of the episodic and chronic migraine patients. And there are few studies only compared with the migraine with controls and chronic migraine with chronic TTH patients. And further, most of the studies have either done a clinical assessment by using only the sleep scales or the objective parameters like polysomnography, but not done in the both. And depression is also common in migraine patients. And very few studies have assessed the role of depression as a confounding factor for the sleep disturbances seen in the migraine. And my aims and objectives are mainly to study and compare the sleep disturbances in episodic migraine and chronic migraine patients by using both the clinical assessment, that is using the Pitzer Sleep Quality Index and overnight polysomnography, and also to study the association of depression in the sleep and sleep disturbances in the migraine. And coming to the inclusion criteria, we have taken the migraine patients diagnosed by the ICHD-3 criteria who were aged 18 to 65 years, and migraine drug-naive patients, that is those who are not on any prophylactic medications, but patient could take only the acute attack for the medications only for the acute attack, such as NSAIDs, and there is no any medication overuse headaches. And by the exclusion criteria, we didn't take any patient of the secondary headache or pregnant women or patients with signs of any systemic comorbidities or patients on any chronic medications. And we have taken the mainly this PSQI. Why PSQI? We have it defines and quantifies the sleep quality, and it is a reliable, standard, and valid measure of the sleep quality, and it discriminates the poor and good sleepers, and it is an easy index for the clinician and for the research purpose to interpret, and it is a test. It has the significant test, retest, validity, and reliability and consistency. And it also has a brief clinical useful assessment to define the variety of the sleep disturbances in every patient, and objectively by the polysomnography. And in the PSQI, we have evaluated for the 7 components such as subject to sleep quality, sleep duration, sleep latency, habitual sleep efficiency, whether there is a using of any sleep medication or not, and sleep disturbances and daytime dysfunction. It is a 19 individual item and generates 7 component scores. All component scores together constitute a global score which ranged from 0 to 21. As the highest number indicates the poor sleep quality. Greater than 5 is a cutoff. Greater than 5 is poor sleep quality. And we have taken the polysomnography parameters, which included that total time in bed, that is getting of the time and get of the bed. That is the total time in bed, the period, and the total sleep time, the period which the patient sleeps whole of the total sleep, and sleep latency, the period when the when patient get into the bed and when the patient acquires the sleep, and rapid eye movement latency, the period in which the first time of the REM sleep occurs as the first time of the echo, and sleep efficiency, it is except in the percentage. It is the total sleep time by total time in bed into 100. Greater than 85% has the good sleep efficiency. Wake after sleep onset, this is called VASO. It mainly determines the sleep fragmentation. When there is prolonged sleep, when there is prolonged VASO, there is decreased sleep efficiency. It is VASO is the total wake time period after the sleep onset, and we included that the percentages of the non-REM, that is N1, N2, and N3 stages. And for psychiatric comorbidity, a screening question was assessed, and this was followed by detailed instruments for the PHQ, whether the patient has depression, somatization, or anxiety, by the depression by the Hamilton depression rating scale, and anxiety by the generalized anxiety disorder scale. Coming to the results, we have taken the demographic profile of the 70 migraine patients who were 46 among the 70 migraine patients. 46 were the episodic migraine, and 24 are the chronic migraine, and there is no any significant p-value in the age and sex and in education and occupation. But patient has the depression is the main significant psychiatric comorbidity, which is having the p-value significant in the chronic migraine. In our study, among the 24 chronic migraine patients, 23 were having the depression. And in 46 migraine patients, episodic migraine patients, only 27 patients having the episodic migraine, depression. And the p-value is very significant in the psychiatric comorbidity in the depression factor. And we have concluded that the Hamilton depression score is also significant, having the p-value is significant. Coming to the headache characteristics, the attack duration and migraine days per month and visual analog score and headache impact test 6 is having the significant in the chronic migraine when compared to the episodic migraine. Coming to the PSQI, the PSQI has a PSQI global component score and individual component scores except sleep disturbances having the very much significant p-value in our study. As we have seen that the chronic migraine is having 10.87 plus or minus 3.99 when compared to episodic migraine 7.93 plus or minus 3.66 and having the very much significant p-value. And the individual component scores except the sleep disturbances, we are having the subjective sleep quality and there is prolonged sleep latency and the sleep durations, habitual sleep efficiency and daytime dysfunction is having very much significant p-value in our study. And none of the migraine patients had used sleeping medications in both episodic and chronic migraine. And coming to the polysomnography parameters, there is prolonged sleep latency in the chronic migraine patients and decreased sleep efficiency in the chronic migraine patients and prolonged wake after sleep onset in the chronic migraine patients, despite the patient was greater taken in the total time in bed, and the greater total time in bed is seen in the chronic migraine patients, is having the very much significant p-value in our study, but there is not much significant in the total sleep time and REM latency and N1, N2, N3 stages and REM sleep and apnea hypopnea index and periodic limb movement index and arousals. Whether the depression and sleep quality and PSG parameters is correlated or not. We have taken the overall effect of depression and sleep in 70 patients, that is 46 episodic and 24 chronic migraine patients. Among them, 50 patients had got the depression and 20 patients didn't got the depression. That is the global PSQS score and decreased sleep efficiency and prolonged wake after sleep onset is much more significant in the depression patients than the non-depression patients. And we have correlated that depression is significantly affecting the sleep quality alone or in the migraine. Objectively, we have correlated that objectively it is correlated or not. And there is correlation of the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale score with sleep in the 24 chronic migraine patients. There is objectively we have correlated that there is no correlation of the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale score with the sleep objectively. So coming to the discussion, chronic migraine patients had higher prevalence of migraine days and headache severity and headache duration, headache related disability and depression when compared to the episodic migraine patients. And chronic migraine patients had worse global PSPO score and worse individual PSPO component scores as compared to the episodic migraine. And these were confirmed on objective testing also by polysomnography as prolonged sleep latency, decreased sleep efficiency and prolonged wake after sleep onset in the chronic migraine patients. And conclusion, the presence of depression was associated with the worse global efficiency and prolong of the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale score with the subjective scales and or polysomnography sleep parameters in the patients. Hence, although depression does have an effect on sleep disturbances, may not be the only factor producing sleep disturbances in the chronic migraine patients. And this is the first study that there is comparison of the head-to-head clinical subjective sleep quality and PSG between the episodic and chronic migraine patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murli.
Thank you, sir.
A good presentation. And now all the 6 speakers have delivered their talk. We are late by around 15 to 20 minutes. First 10 minutes were during the first session, and now another 15 minutes late. But I think the speakers were good and they have completed their presentation. Thank you very much. And I hand over to the organizers.